there was a very large or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream. The other sound that I heard at that same time or right after was sort of an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody.
When Sydney Powell's parents sent her off to college, they were really excited for her. She had been a great high school student, she had lots of energy, and her mom was a huge role model for her. Sydney and her mother Brenda were best friends. Everyone who knew Sydney thought Brenda had inspired her to be a kind, hardworking individual, and that Sydney would have a bright career ahead of her. But something went wrong at college, and Sydney kept it all a secret. Secrets, lies, and shame piled up until it was too late. Why did Sydney unalive her mother, someone she saw as her closest friend? Why did her college counselor listen to the horrific incident on the phone? And where is Sydney now? We'll explore these questions and many more in today's video. On March 3rd, 2020, Stephen Powell rushed home from work. He had seen his daughter arrive at home on the tracking app the whole family had. He had to know why his daughter Sydney was home so early and why she wasn't at college in the first place. Stephen left his phone at work. He didn't want Sydney to see him coming home on the app and run away. It was about time they had a heart-to-heart talk about college. When Stephen surprised Sydney at home, she said that she was having some trouble at college, but she was still attending some classes.
She said she was still going to some of her classes with her friend Lauren.
Sydney was spiraling, so her dad was calm and reassuring.
I said we'd go through, let's get through this semester, and if you needed to take the summer off or go to school, we would work through it.
But Sydney was still upset. More than anything, she seemed upset with herself.
I remember she said, all her friends have their together and she doesn't, and I told her, no, that's not true. She didn't know what she wanted to do, it sounded like.
Stephen saw his daughter lost and afraid for the first time, so he suggested they call Brenda, Sydney's mom. Brenda was at work at the Children's Hospital, but they were sure she could excuse herself for an hour to talk her daughter through a moment of crisis. Brenda treated children and teenagers suffering from cancer. She'd been doing so for 28 years, and she was prolific at it. Therefore, she was also exceptional at handling highly emotional situations and guiding people through tough times. So Stephen was right. She was the right person to talk to her daughter that day. After a brief call, Brenda agreed to come home for an hour or so and then head back to work. But Stephen had to get back to work by now, so he left before Brenda arrived home, and they kept in touch via text. At 12:41 p.m., Stephen sent his wife the last text message. "What did you discuss with Sydney?" Brenda had taken time off crucial work to head home and talk to her daughter out of a crisis, even though Sydney had been lying to her for years. Minutes later, she would be dead. Brenda K. Powell was born in March 1969 and lived in Akron, Ohio since she was a teenager. After graduating from university, she started working as a child life specialist in the hematology oncology unit at Akron Children's Hospital. Meanwhile, she met a man named Stephen. The two got married and had 2 kids, Sydney and Andrew. Her obituary would say, Brenda's husband and children were the lights of her life. She was devoted to them unconditionally. She brought the same energy and caring to the families and children she met at work. She founded the Oncology Teen Program. She planned activities for the entire family and helped them celebrate every success. The care provided and the relationships developed contributed to individual and memorable moments that would last a lifetime. Her influence extended throughout the Akron children's community and beyond. She was a beautiful, cherished friend to many. Brenda wanted her children to have the same attitude in life. Her eldest child, Sydney, was a great student at St. Vincent St. Mary High School in Akron. She was also really close to her mom, so Brenda was sure she had a bright career ahead. Before graduating from high school, Sydney and her family chose Mount Union as her preferred college. It was a 45-minute drive from home, and Sydney wanted to be close to Brenda and her loved ones in Akron. To no one's surprise, Sydney got in with a presidential scholarship in 2018. This meant a full 4-year scholarship covering tuition fees, on-campus room board, and other fees. The family was elated. Not only had Sydney ensured a great academic life for herself, but she was close enough to home to come whenever she felt a little homesick. Brenda could visit too when she had the time. Indeed, people around Brenda and Sydney saw them as the best of friends. And that didn't go away once Sydney started her classes. The two would talk every single day and see each other face to face several times a week. Things were even better. Sydney managed to get a dorm room with her high school bestie, Lauren. What could be nicer than hanging out with your school bestie at college and your mom outside college hours? All seemed well for a year and a half. Sydney would come home during breaks and tell her parents how cool college was. When they spoke on the phone, Sydney would gush over her new friends and the fun times she spent with Lauren. But Sydney was an adult now. Colleges don't just share grades with your parents, even when they are paying the bills. So Sydney's parents didn't check on her academic situation until the beginning of 2020. In early 2020, when Sydney was technically in the second semester of her second year, her dad, Steven, decided to log into the college portal to pay some extra bills. He was surprised to see he was locked out.
Any information that something might be going on with Sydney and Mount Union?
The only thing that I knew is when I tried to sign on to the, their whatever app that they have on the website, it kept kicking me out.
Why were you trying to get into that portal?
Seeing, because the 529 plan didn't cover all the tuition for the year, so I had to make a personal check.
That was the first time Steven thought something might be going on with his daughter. When he asked her why his access to the portal was denied, she said it must be some sort of admin mistake. On February 25th, 2020, Brenda texted her daughter, "Why do I always feel like you're scamming me? Just remember, you need to keep the grades to keep your scholarship." Sydney replied, "My grades are good, thank you very much." Brenda was onto something, but she wanted to trust her daughter. She was an adult. She didn't want to invade her privacy, she just wanted to guide her to a great start in life. Her parents were becoming increasingly suspicious. What was she hiding, and why? On March 3rd, Steven still couldn't get into the school portal. Sydney had promised to sort out the mistake, and she'd had a lot of time to do it. Now, Steven thought Sydney was lying, so he called the school office. Lo and behold, Sydney was not even enrolled at Mount Union.
The conversation was that Sydney wasn't enrolled anymore, and then I asked for how long, and they said, "You have to ask her."
Okay. And I'm sure that came as a shock to you?
Yes.
Shocked and disappointed, Steven checked the Home 360 app on his phone. It was a tracking app the family had been using for years. Since Sydney had gone off to college, they'd stopped checking on her. Now, Steven decided to take a look and noticed that she was at the family home. He was at work but decided to rush home and confront her about the college situation. When Steven spoke to his daughter, she broke down and explained that she'd been expelled back in December 2019. She was failing 3 or 4 classes, and no one knew about it, not even her best friend, Lauren. Patient and understanding, Steven told Sydney that they would get through this crisis together. Before heading back to work, he called his wife to summarize the talk he'd just had with Sydney. Of course, this came as a shock to Brenda. Steven suggested she speak to Sydney after her work at the hospital, but Brenda hurried home. She was concerned and quite fairly upset with her daughter. She thought they were best friends. Why had she been lying to her for so long and letting them pay the bills? Brenda got in the driveway around 12:15 p.m., minutes after Steven had left for work. A minute or two later, she left a phone message with the admin office at Mount Union. At 12:36 p.m., college admins Michelle Gaffney and John Fraser returned the call. Brenda picked up.
Dean Fraser was sitting at his desk and I was sitting next to it. He dialed, the phone was answered, and Mrs. Powell answered. So Dean Fraser was speaking and simply said, "Brenda, this is Dean Fraser. I'm sitting here with Michelle Gaffney, our associate dean of students. We're returning your call," and that's about as far as we got.
Brenda only got to say, "Yes, this is Brenda Powell." Those were her last words. From the other end of the phone, Michelle and John listened in horror as a thud and a scream ended the call.
There was a very large or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream. The sound that I heard at that same time, or right after, was sort of an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody.
Brenda didn't even get an explanation from her daughter. Sydney unalived her mother with a frying pan. 6 thuds later, the call ended. Michelle dialed back twice. The first time, no one picked up. The second time, 3 minutes after the first thud, someone did. When John asked, "Brenda, is that you?" the voice replied, "Yes, this is Brenda," but it wasn't Brenda.
Miss Gaffney, did you recognize that voice on the line?
Yeah,
Okay, was that Brenda
it
Powell?
was not Brenda.
Who did you recognize that voice?
I was sure it was Sydney. Both Dean Fraser and I looked at each other and sort of shook our heads at each other. And he then said, I don't, Sydney, I think this is you.
The call was then interrupted, and Michelle and John phoned 911.
They were on the phone, and there was a lot of screaming going on, so he couldn't really say if it was like a physical fight, but just heard like a lot of yelling and screaming going on.
If you didn't think it until now, Sydney was not a master of lies. When officers arrived at the scene, they found a broken window. Sydney was crying. She told them that Brenda had told her to flee the house as someone had broken in. The officers didn't buy it for 1 second. First of all, there were red marks all over the broken window. This meant that it was broken after the crime was committed. Second of all, the scenario just didn't add up. Her mother had told her to run, she didn't, yet the perpetrator only took Brenda's life? No! The scenario was quite clear. Sydney took her poor mother's life and then stayed there and attempted to cover for herself. Countless lies, ever more sickening, until she couldn't run away from the truth anymore. When the officers found Sydney at home, she was hysterical. Then she went into a catatonic state. Finally, the reality was catching up to her. Finally, she realized her actions had consequences. The cast iron skillet and a steak knife were lying on the floor of the master bedroom, painted red. It was a frenzied attack, something that reminded more of a rabid animal than of someone who claimed to be Brenda's daughter and best friend. During Sydney's trial, the full story was revealed. Sydney had had trouble at college from day one. It's unclear whether she just liked to party, sleep, or had other issues going on, but her grades were not good, and her attendance decreased with every semester. In December 2019, she was expelled after failing 3 classes. This also meant that she had to evacuate the dorm room. However, Sydney behaved like nothing had happened. She went home on winter break, told her parents all was well, then went back to the dorm, pretending she was still a Mount Union student. Lauren didn't know a thing. Weeks into this, Michelle Gaffney had to call Sydney to her office and tell her that she needed to pack her things. Sydney told Lauren she was taking some time off college to figure things out. Then she proceeded to live in hotel rooms until March 3rd when she ran out of cash. That was the day it all went down. Sydney's attorney argued that she was not guilty by reason of insanity. When she took her mother's life, she was in a psychotic state, hence her catatonic state when she truly realized what she had done, they argued. In September 2023, Sydney's trial began. 3 clinicians brought by the defense said that Sydney suffered from schizophrenia, a schizo-defective disorder, and malingering, respectively. However, the state clinician brought in by the prosecution said that is not true. After assessing Sydney, they concluded that she could only be diagnosed with anxiety disorder, and that did not mean she could escape responsibility for what she had done. On September 20th, Sydney Powell was found guilty of murder and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Sydney had never shown signs of mental health issues before. Until she graduated high school, she was a straight-A student, described as charismatic and social. Up until March 3rd, Sydney calmly lied to her family and friends about her school situation. She was composed and fulfilled everyday tasks as usual. No one witnessed her mental health decline or any psychotic episodes. Sydney had also Googled how to kill someone and how long does it take to bleed out a few days before. This was premeditated. Out of all the moments Sydney could have had a psychotic episode and took her mom's life, she just so happened to do so when Brenda was on the phone with her former college. She also worked hard to deceive law enforcement and escape justice immediately after taking Brenda's life. None of these facts are consistent with a psychotic break. According to psychiatrist Dr. Todd Grande, Sydney was used to getting everything she wanted. When college life proved trickier, she gave in, but refused to accept the consequences. She wanted everyone to live her fantasy, refusing to share her failures with even her closest people. On March 3rd, her failures had caught up to her. She'd been kicked out of the dorm, run out of cash, and her father had discovered her lies. The amount of shame she experienced reached a boiling point, and she took her anger and frustration out on her mother. It's possible Sydney perceived Brenda as a source of pressure, the person who wanted her to succeed in life the most. While Sydney's tears during her sentence seemed real, who's to know if they are for her mother or for herself? It's truly heartbreaking to think that a kind, giving person like Brenda would find such a brutal end at the hands of someone she loved most. And it's just as scary to think that someone in your own home can harbor these thoughts and perfectly hide them for months. No matter how many years Sydney ends up spending in prison, it won't do justice to Brenda or to the shattered family she left behind. Hey, thanks for watching. Remember to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. See you next time.